I hope that we get some attention in the media and in the public, and to steer a debate and to make people think about what is the current status of the world, and to see whether we can get people actually interested in this topic, but also to make an impact on policymakers to change things, because I think there are a lot of important issues, and we need to policies and policymakers to change a lot of things in the world to make it a better place. So there are two issues, I think. One is that we observe an increasing inequality, increasing concentration of income and wealth in the hand of very few, at least in many countries. And I think that's a big problem, because if there's a lot of concentration of wealth and income, this also means a concentration of power. And giving this increasing power or political power maybe in the hands of a few, that I think that's not a good thing for society, for democracy. So we need we should be worried about this, and we need to think of what we can do about this. And tax policy is one instrument to change this. And the other thing is the question of opportunity. So ideally, one should wish that every baby born has the same chances, the same opportunities to become whatever he or she wants. So to become president, to become rich, or to become just whatever they want. But we know that people don't have the same opportunities.
I've been working for Academic Stand Against Poverty, because I think the greatest is global poverty, aggravated by climate change and falling into negative feedback of poverty is not at the moment the main cause of climatic instability. Is the rich that have mainly created climate change. But as climate change increases global poverty, the poor will be increasingly forced to just concentrate on day-to-day survival and not think about the best long-term use of the resources, which would lead to greater aggravation of environmental problems, leading to more poverty, and falling into this spiral is my greatest worry. I think global taxation is feasible. Global environmental taxation is feasible, is necessary. You don't have to start with very high rates, so I think it really is possible. It's just a matter of political will, but it really is possible, and it could make a massive difference. I mean, if the taxes are on the environment, even if we didn't use the funding that we can gather extremely well, it would already be beneficial because of the effect that it would have on resource conservation and climate change.
Much as there is taking place in the world, a development process which is quite spectacular in certain countries, and China is the most notable example, of course, of this kind. A large number of countries and very large number of people have also been left out. And not just left out a little, but almost entirely left out in many cases. And perhaps these developments are not completely unconnected as well. If one thinks about the situation of many of the middle-income countries, including the lower middle-income countries, which don't have very low wages, it's very hard for them to compete on the basis of labor cost, which used to be traditionally thought of as a resource of developing countries, that they had large and abundant labor forces which were able to work at relatively low costs, which enabled these countries to have comparative advantage in the production of labor-intensive commodities in the world market. But countries such as, for example, Mexico have for some time had difficulty finding the niche that one might have expected them to have, because there is still lower wage competition which is available out there, let alone countries such as, for example, Greece, which are in an entirely different income range, but also find themselves quite challenged in this respect. So you have a very large number of countries in the world which are not able to achieve the kinds of growth rates which would be needed to really transform them and to meet the material aspirations of their people. But it's not just a question of aggregate growth rates, and it would be a great mistake to focus only on that, as of course many analysts of contemporary societies have pointed out. It's also very much a question of whether the process of growth that's taking place is sufficiently inclusive or not. And there the issue is that increasingly the kinds of productive niches that countries are finding are ones which are not necessarily very employment generating. So you have a process which involves jobless growth in many countries.
I have a recent project on gender and peace negotiations, because it's striking how few women conduct international mediation. We're talking about figures like 4 to 6% of all the efforts of international mediation is conducted by women. So we need to raise the issue of inclusion of women in general, but definitely when we talk about the elite level, get women to have a say about peace in order to understand and to promote a notion of sustainable peace. And I do think that we also need to do much more work and research on gender-based violence and sexual violence in conflict. I think we can see and hear daily in the Middle East and the human catastrophe that is taking place in Syria that raises these issues. So I do think we need to address them among many other issues, of course, and to think seriously, not only about peace building in the long term, but also think very seriously about protection. And in regards to protection, I think also the migration crisis in Europe developing is raising that issue. And I do think that thinking about social progress, about social justice, will help us rethink strategies that are more constructively engaging and addressing these issues.
One really important thing with respect to the provision of education in some places in the world is whether or not girls have the same opportunities or access to education as boys do, and the importance of the promotion of equal status for girls and boys with respect to education. In other parts of the world, that's a completely settled and uncontroversial issue, so that doesn't make it an especially interesting focus, but it means that there's an interesting divide to be bridged within the chapter and our work. More generally, I'd say that there's an enormous body of social science evidence now that shows just how important educational attainment and skill development is to the economic interests of a country and to the job prospects of any individual who receives education. So we can say without a doubt that the provision of educational opportunity in primary and secondary and in higher education is just absolutely crucial to the economic well-being of a society and to any individual who receives it. But is that the only thing that's important? What about civic opportunities and civic education? And more interestingly, I think, how should educational opportunity be understood with respect to social mobility, religious education and identity, cultural diversity, and the various systems that provide and govern education have to take all of these factors into account, so that understanding what equal educational opportunity should mean for policy is an incredibly complex theoretical question as well as practical issue.
One thing that I have been working on a lot is the rise of a global surveillance society. And when I say that, people sometimes think, oh, Edward Snowden and state surveillance and national security. And actually, what I work on is the rise of a commercial surveillance society and the increasing power of public-private partnerships in surveillance. A lot of the information is collected from us in many instances, not all, but through the ordinary communications tools and our phones, right, and our networks and our computers and things that we use in our everyday life. And there is a set of processes that often are invisible to ordinary people by which that information is becoming monetized and commodified and transforming you and me and everybody else into raw materials, essentially. And that feeds then state surveillance processes as well. The government can go to the community communications provider to get information. And what my work explores, and what I think is extraordinarily important for the kind of society that we're constructing, is the implications of that for our privacy, for our collective self-development, for our culture, for our human rights. If you look at international human rights treaties and institutions, they're enormously state-focused, and so they're concerned with the ways that nation-states can preserve or violate human rights. They are struggling to catch up to a world in which what violates the basic human rights is a set of public-private partnerships that the treaties and the formulations of human rights don't even speak to yet. And so that's I think, enormously important, obviously in my own work, but I like to think for society generally, to figure out how to understand basic guarantees of privacy and human rights for a future in which surveillance is a mode of commercial activity, as well as a mode of national security.